This is a marvelous company. Now, I would test the protocols. We already looked at the company. I would test the protocols. Also, we can check. Really, I look at the company statements. Most of all, if I find something a bit off when it comes to their net income, like why did it drop? Why did it go down? Well, we can look at this. Yeah, let's see. Why did their net income come down? Why did their free cash flow sort of came down in their cash? I'm pretty sure it's the development, the research development. So the way how to look at that, we can just scroll all the way down and they'll give us an answer. This is why, look, I'm betting on search for this, most of all. I'm betting on mostly search more than anything else. And they're going to stay dominant. Google search to me is more dominant than Gmail and anything else. That's what I'm betting on the most. Now, Gmail is dominant, but it's not as compared to its search. And that's where they're making all their revenue. Okay, let's look at their statements. Let's see why their net income decreased. Revenue were 28.2 billion, an increase of 10% over the year, primarily because of Google services revenue of 16 billion and 7% increase in Google Cloud revenue. Total currency revenues, which exclude the hedge, of increased 14%. Cost of revenue was increased 14% over year, primarily driven an increase in other cost of revenue. Other expenses were 81 billion, an increase of 20% year per year, primarily driven by increased compensation expenses due to headcount. Okay, so in their own organization, the services and fees, advertising, promotional. On September 2022, we closed the acquisition of Mandiant for a total purchase of 6.1 billion and added more than 2,600 employees. Mandiant's financial results are reported with Google Cloud as one of the acquisition dates. On July 15, 2022, we executed a 20-for-1 stock split, of July 1st, effective the form of one stock special stock dividend on each of the shares of the company's Class A, B, and C shares. All prior period references made to share or per share amounts through this management discussion. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Beginning the first quarter, we suspended the vast majority of our commercial activities in Russia and effectively seized. You see, it's going to affect Russia a lot. People are not going to use excuse my words, the crappy search engine if there is in Russia. It doesn't even come close because of the experience. So it always happens. And effectiveness seized because they're not going to get the whole data in the world, just in their country. That's not going to be even that well. And effectively seized in business activities of a Russian entity. The ongoing effect of these direct actions on our financial result was not material. The broader economic effect resulting from the war in Ukraine on our future financial result may be unpredictable. Yeah, but that's not going to affect at all if Google's going to make more money on its search and these different products. No, it's not. For the year it ended, operating cash flow was 91 billion. Capital expenditures reflected investment in technical infrastructure were 31 billion. They had 190,000 employees. Hi, everyone. So what I actually found, what was this reducing Google's net income right over here is in fact if you check, look, the net income has dropped. The reason for that was because it wasn't from the research development. It was actually, and this is one of the practical ways, this is actually me recording this in the future because I realized that there's a simple way of explaining it compared to what I was going to show you. And it's, if you go down to the income statement right here in the breakdown, if you go towards the year that you were looking at, right? Now, this can show you and it can also not show you. And I'll show you what it showed me. So if we look at the net income, right, compared to last year it was at 76 billion. And for 2022, it was 60 billion. But if we look at the, let's say, gross profit, look, the gross profit is actually higher, right? In 2022, it's higher. And then if we look at the operating income is actually a bit lower. And that's simply because if you look at the SG&A, let's see, it was 36 billion. On 2022, you see it raised by about 6 billion. And then the R&D, and that's normal because their revenue is going up. They need to, in fact, they had more cash because of 2022 to invest back to their business from the government plan to give, because there was more attractive rates with interest rates and getting more loans, that a lot of these companies took advantage of that and put a bunch of that leverage into, let's say, research and development in the case of Google. So their R&D was 31 billion. I don't think it was actually the R&D. The R&D did go up by 39, but you can see that this isn't primarily what dropped it. It did drop it a bit, but not hugely. If we look at the pre-tax income, the pre-tax income for 2021 was actually 90 billion. But if you look at 2022, look, it's 71 billion. Okay, so there's something here that really dropped it down more. So if you look at the net interest income, the net interest income for last year is actually the same. But look, the main causer of this was actually the other income expense, right? Look, the other income expense for 2021 was actually a positive gain for Google of 10 billion, right? So they actually received 10 billion. But if you look at 2022, look, their other income expense actually reduced them by 5 billion. You see, that's actually That's actually a decrease of about $15 billion. And that's why it dropped down so much by that. So that's a good sign. Right? You see, like, this is why you have to look at the facts, the numbers of what's actually moving let's say the events or situation of what you're looking at. In this case, what's the main causer that the net income dropped down was not from their products or their operating expenses like their research and development. It was actually the deductions that are come abide after the operating income. They're the deductions like taxes or interest expenses. In this case, it was one of those sections. Now, if you want to see primarily what specifically it was, we can just look at the 10K for that. So I actually found out, I was looking at you can see it's page 31, right? When you go to this section, you can find it. So right here, the main reason why we weren't able to find it here is because this is just only specifying the revenue, but it's not, it didn't specify the other income expense. You can see that the other income expense here was 12 billion from 2021. And then from 2022, it was actually negative 3 billion, right? But if you keep scrolling down, you can see that it doesn't explain that until if you go all the way down, which is the case. Some companies do have this, let's say, layout in their documents, like Google, but some companies don't, depending on their industry in terms of what other expenses they have compared to what other companies don't have. So just keep in mind, that's why I find that the most practical way is looking at Google Focus and seeing a summarized version of their income statement of what you can see by basics of what dropped down the income if you can. And if you can't, then you have to manually go down to the statements like this and try to, like a scavenger hunt, you have to really try to find it. But here it is. If we look at the costs and expenses and keep going down, you can see that it's going to specify segment profitability. So here it is, operating income loss. But that's not exactly it. We need to look at other income. So here it is, other income expense, 12 billion to 3 billion. This is what we were trying to look for. If you look at this, it's saying that the other income expense is actually decreased by 15.5 billion from 2021 to 2022, primarily due to changes in gains and losses on equity securities and performance fees. Okay, so that's a good sign. So the main reason why their net income went down was one, because of other income expenses, such as gains and losses on their equity securities. So they were primarily due to the investments they were doing. And that makes sense because in 2022, for some of you who don't know exactly about what happened in the stock market, in 2022, the economy and the market didn't have attractive equity securities in terms of bonds per se, because interest rates were high and inflation was high. So a lot of equity securities weren't preferable. And in fact, a lot of bonds per se actually went down because, when interest rates go up, the bond value temporarily goes down, right? So bonds go down. And I'm pretty sure that based upon from that, I could say that that was one of the main reasons, because they're talking about equity securities. And equity securities in the short term are moved in majority of the times by like interest rates per se. So you can see here that they said 3.2 billion of net unrealized losses were recognized on marketable equity securities. So that's what we're saying. And $1.5 billion of net realized loss were recognized on debt securities. Okay, that makes sense because that was not an extremely favorable thing to hold in 2022 just because the interest expense on that debt was raising because interest rates were going up. So that would make sense why they were losing a bit more on the other income expenses. Because remember, these are not expenses deducted primarily in the business in terms of development cost or payroll costs for their employees, in terms of administration or marketing. It has nothing to do with the business. It has to do more with macroeconomics of what's happening in the economy. I mean, so what are the signs of this? What are you could say, like, what is my view about this? Well, if Google dropped down their net income, not because of their business, but because of macroeconomics. Now, is that a big thing? Well, I could say one, that if Google's net income dropped down from 2022 to 2021 because of the other income expenses, which are mostly comprised of equity securities, then it goes to show that Google has quite a bit of equity securities. Because if that was, you can see that dropped the net income. Now, is that a big issue? No. In fact, I think that's normal. I don't think it's fantastic that they have such a big positions on equity securities, but I think it's good. I don't think it's a big problem. And that goes to show with my view that I don't think this is a big problem for Google, even though their net income went down, because it isn't what's going to primarily affect their investments outlook in the next few years, right? Just because their equity securities went down, I don't believe that that's going to affect primarily how they're going to allocate their capital in the next 2 years, because Google has a lot of streams coming from directly in their business. They're not dependent based upon much of the investments that they do outside, like in terms of bonds, right? Because they're not that type of company. They're quite reoccurring income company where they consistently, because that's the thing about technology that frequently happens, or let's say communication services like Facebook or Metaverse, these type of companies make money frequently because they're because in terms, they're really an intangible asset. So there's not much deductions costs or contract costs or any sort of long buffer stages in order to get the sale. Because in Google, you just use the product and it's very direct one-to-one. So, and on top of that, it's the type of product that they're selling that frequently does reoccurring revenue. So because of that other factor, I do believe that Google doesn't have an issue when it comes to these macroeconomic events, because a lot of this equity securities isn't what's going to affect a lot of their capital allocation, which hence can affect more the net income in the next few years. I believe that this is just more of a kind of a position that Google was in, like every other company in the economy, that, their net income went down, because Google isn't the only company that its net income went down temporarily. A lot of different other companies that are huge like Google went down, not because of their business, but because of the macroeconomics of interest rates going up and not a favorable time to hold like debt securities per se, because interest expenses went up from interest rates from the Federal Reserve. So, but in Google's case, Google is very profitable and has a wide distributed capital allocation with different products that are very sustainable. And from those allocations, it's much more likely that even if the, let's say, economy went worse or none of that's more predictions. But let's say in that scenario, it wouldn't be favorable, of course, for Google, but I don't think it would decrease their net income in the next few years just because of their developments and their capital allocations, what they did last year. Keep in mind that Google allocated a big amount of capital, like a lot of different other companies and technologies per se, because it was a favorable time in 2021 from the kind of quote unquote free cash that was given around by the government of low interest rates and a favorable time to hold debt securities, that they were able to use that cash and hire a lot of great talent. So from this, I'm pretty sure that Google and other companies have heavily invested in R&D and different projects that are likely going to increase the amount of demand that they have in their products in the next few years. So that's going to further offset the amount of losses that they could potentially make in equity securities if it did go down macroeconomics. But despite that, yeah, that's what dropped it down. You can see that based upon what I said, it's not a big concern. And that's really the main negative points that I could see here in Google. Other than that, you can see that their net income went up, their operating cash flow has actually, and it stayed the same, but I think it's mostly to do with the macroeconomics and their cash. I think there's two reasons for this. One, because of macro, but also because of their investments they did. Because I did read in their documents that they did make an acquisition as of late in a company, and they acquired employees. Because that's what I meant. Like, they use this cash to hire a lot of new companies and do acquisitions, especially in a favorable time when a lot of these companies were maybe decreasing temporarily in their value from having these high amount of debts where no one wanted to buy them. So it would make sense that Google and even Amazon did that to acquire different companies in this great time of the market, having a low price in the market price. Also, I just want to say that this isn't a main concern for me, right? Because if you look at right, the main root cause of what dropped this down again was the other income expense. However, I just do want to let you know, because at the end of the day, we're investing in this company for the very long term, right? So, and despite this, a lot of people will look at this with more importance and might say, with a bit more, let's say, power to that problem, to their decision making, to say, I'm not going to invest in this company as much. However, I just do want to remind you that we're investing in this company for the next 20, 30 years or more, right? So it's different when you're going to invest for just a few years to make a quick capital gain. In this case, we're not seen to make a quick capital gain. We're seen to make a wealthy gain. We're seen for the company to grow. That's the main reason why we're investing into this. So for me, it's not a main concern that some equity security for them drop down in the short term. And it would be a concern for me if that equity security was the one of the biggest main instruments of assets of what gave them a big income stream to allocate that capital back to the business if they were dependent on that. And on top of that, from depending on that equity security, that maybe the product wasn't that well, right? Because there are some companies like that, and that's how they remain afloat and increase their cash flow and increases their stock from the high. But despite that, that's not what's happening in Google, right? That those companies, if it was like that sort of scenario, I wouldn't invest in Google in the first place. But if Google had a main instrument of equity that it was highly dependent on that asset and that asset's volatile in the market, I'm saying that it's a big portion, right? That's now talking about the balance sheet, right? If in that balance sheet they were hugely dependent, more than 50% of their asset, hugely dependent on equities, on a marketable equity security per se, I would be skeptical, right? And I wouldn't invest. I would actually decrease the amount of span of time Google can last, and I would consider Google to have a lower allocation of my capital just because of its risk that there is there, because they're dependent on that. However, you might be thinking, okay, but what if, is that a problem? No, because by fact, like a lot of companies are not going to do that because it doesn't serve that type of business they're running. Now, the type of business that more likely moves towards that scenario is banks, because banks by nature have to have multiple different streams in order to use the capital they're using by leverage to invest in the capital. And they invested in everything. They invested in real estate, they invested in mortgage securities, they invested in debt securities, they invested in bonds, all this stuff. But that's for banks. Banks need to do that. However, for Google's case, or for Apple's case, or for Metaverse, Amazon, Tesla, Chevron, whatever, these different companies that aren't banks don't typically do that. Or even Johnson & Johnson. None of these companies do that. They don't tend to happen. However, if in some case they do tend to do that, and if that scenario where I told you where they're mostly dependent on that equity security and it's a big portion in that balance sheet towards their assets, I would just be skeptical and I would lower my allocation amount. However, what my main concern is, as a long-term shareholder, as a long-term business owner for Google in this case, I mostly care that if I see the net income down, that deduction was mostly caused by what they're selling, right? Is it a cause that they lost a lot of money from a bad product they made, or a bad investment they made in an acquisition that was highly dependent from that acquisition to increase their product value? You see those type of metrics. However, if it was that sort of case where it was an acquisition, that still wouldn't mean that I wouldn't invest into it. I can't give you exact specific scenarios because many scenarios can happen in terms of those different situations. What I would tell you is that I'm mostly keen in importance to define whether how much I want to invest in a company, or whether I want to even invest in the company in the first place, is due to the fact of anything that's related inside the business, anything that's related towards what they're selling, whether it's the product, whether it's the service, whether it was an acquisition that they made that was highly dependent on that product or service and it ridiculously decreased the value of their product and service, would keep me more cautious of the business because of, one, of their decision making, and two, because of the type of valuation the product or service has, that it's it's pretty vulnerable towards that point. You see, but that's not what's happening in Google. If that did happen in Google, now it depends, right? Like if that was the case where their product or service was dependent upon the securities they're making, or their investments that they're making, or some sort of assets, right? Or some sort of asset in their business is highly dependent to supply that product. And if it wasn't for that asset, that, let's say the asset is outside of the business, right? Not inside, because every product in every business has to have an asset in order to supply. But if this asset was outside of the business, outside of their industry, what they're investing in, and they're just using some capital to put it into their product or service, and if it wasn't for that capital, for that instrument, and that instrument was abolished, I would not invest in that company, right? Not because it's a terrible company. It's because, again, I invest in the best companies in the world. I'm not going to invest in this type of company because I know I can find better companies. So you might be saying, okay, then what should I do in that scenario? Well, if you had a company like that, then I would say, you know what, let's leave this on standby. But to be honest, I wouldn't even leave it on standby. I would just forget the company and try to find another company. Why? Because at the end of the day, you want to find the best companies. You're finding diamonds here. You're finding companies that you fully understand and that are highly profitable companies and are highly demanded companies too, and highly stable. So there's not a lot of those companies, but there definitely is a few of them under the sheets, and you can find them if you just navigate and research. I'm not going to teach this in this video, but in the next video, I'm going to teach you the way how I find companies, because maybe that's sort of a question you can have, that you might be thinking, I wonder how he knows how to find a company. How do you know where to find a company? Where can we find these companies? And I'm going to explain that in the next lesson, because that's an important topic. And it's quite a practical but a fun topic, because you get to completely research the entire industry per se, and which ones are the top demanding. And even despite the industry, is it at the end of the day something that you fully understand, right? Because it's not about, like, because someone can say AI is the future, I'm going to invest into it. But what I would say is that, okay, but do you fully understand what this company is about? Like, do you fully understand how they're going to make more money in the future? I don't care whether you are highly optimistic on AI. This isn't about being optimistic about something or being pessimistic. It's about understanding the product or service that they're selling and knowing that product or service is going to make more money in the next 10, 20 to 30 years. That's just what the end of it as it is. So you have to fully understand the product and service that they're selling, and knowing the consumer behavior on that product or service, which is really the industry, to understand the consumer behavior and know the advantages primarily that you know that business has, that it's so clear. And once you understand that, once you did the statements and numbers, you know that you have a great business in your hands. But to make it perfect, you have to fully understand it and, test it with the protocols and such. But that's one of the factors I wanted to say, that because that's maybe something that people are not going to have clear when they're reading the documents. When I look at a decrease in the net income or the cash, I don't get highly concerned. But that's the thing, because in investing in the long growth, you're not being highly concerned that you're not going to invest into it. You're just being analytic. That's what you're doing at the end of the day. You just want to be analytic to see every detail, because when you know every detail into this business, you know if this business is a catch on for you, and you know for sure if it's not at an instant. So that's the whole point of these deep analytic factors. But yeah, at the end, that's how I look upon it. If the net income went down, you saw what I did. I either look at here. If I don't find it here, I look at the documents and I just scroll through until I see a segment that relevantly correlates towards what that effect is, right? What factor causes a net income? Well, what can cause the net income would be the gross profit, would be the operating expenses, would be the operating income, and the pre-tax. So when you know that, you know where to look. If you're looking at cash flow, you're going to be looking relatively towards, the investments that they're making, their income from their operating activities, whether that's relevant, all this sort of matters. And at the end, you're going to find the capital expenditures, but those are the factors that you're going to find. You just have to be analytic. I don't get concerned about equity securities, because is the equity security in Google going to highly affect if Google is going to sell more products in the next 10 to 20 years? Absolutely not. What's going to highly influence Google selling more in the next 20 to 30 years and growing more at an exponential rate is going to be their main independent dominance in their product value, in their service value, which is what I call the core value, right? And that's what's important when you look at these statements, to see if that value has been compromised based upon what they have internally in the business, not by macroeconomics. Now, if it was by macroeconomics, what I would be concerned is that if that business is dependent fully on macroeconomics, meaning that if some investment, like what I just said in the debt securities, if their equity securities is a big portion in their assets, and that asset is supplying in total what their business is making towards their revenue streams, then I would be concerned, because if that asset gets abolished, their product doesn't have value. And for that, the product doesn't even have value in the first place, because the product is dependent upon something outside of the product. That's what I mean by product value. I don't like businesses that are dependent. I don't like product values that are dependent outside of the product. No, that's not a business I look at. I look at a business that makes money simply on what they're selling to their customers, not by doing a lot of this third party stuff and, zipping here like a bank. It's not that. When you look at Google per se, you care what they're selling. It's just B2B, A to B. It's that simple. It's not A to B. It's not relevant. You have to get through F and get it through D and supply that cash to A. I don't like those businesses, because those businesses don't last for a long time. You want to see a business simply that it sells its products as a core value. It's going to make more money because there's a fully demand for that product, because of what the features and value that they give to their customers only by using that product compared to any other competitor. And that's the reason why people are going to stick with that product for the next, for a long time. So for 2023, we announced a reduction of workforce, approximately 12,000 roles. We expect this isn't because the company's making less money. It's because they got all the free cash from 2020 on the COVID, like every company. And they decided to use this cash to try to get the employees from Microsoft and Apple and Metaverse, but these high-tech engineers, but when there was inflation and they didn't want the revenue to affect as much because of their workforce, not because they're making less money, but because they use leverage, they effectively took out their workforce, which was a temporary role, just to attract more talent to develop something. That's it. But it was just this free cash to everyone. That's not going to affect the business at all. Whether it's going to make more money, not at all, because and what it's doing right now works. We expect to incur employee and services and related charges of 1.9 billion to 2.3 billion, the majority of which will be recognized in the first quarter. In addition, we are taking actions to optimize our global office space. As a result, we expect to incur exit costs relating to office spaces reduction of approximately $500 million, also because of the economy. We may incur additional charges in the future as we further evaluate our real estate needs. We complete assessment of the useful lives of our servers and network equipment, resulting in change of useful life of our servers and server network equipment to 6 years, which we expect to result in a reduction of depreciation of approximately 3.4 billion. That happens to every company. And depreciation for assets and services of 2022 recorded primarily in cost of revenue and R&D expenses. As AI is critical in developing our mission of bringing our breakthrough innovation to the real world, beginning in January 2023, we will update our segment reporting related to certain of Alphabet's AI activities. DeepMind, previously reported with other bets, will report as part of Alphabet's corporate cost, reflecting its increasing collaboration with Google Services, Google Cloud, and other bets. Prior periods will be recast to conform to revised presentation. Look at this. Google makes more its money in Google search. This is why I'm not why, but this is a good sign because I'm this is the most bullish I'm at. I understand nothing can come remotely close to that in 40 years. In more than that, more than 40 years. That's what I'm betting on. I don't know about YouTube. YouTube will last very long. Obviously, they're dominant, but I'm not as understanding, as sure compared to Google search. If you compare it to services, Gmail, whatever, all these stuff will exist as long as people use Google search, right? So I'm looking at the main route. The main route is Google search, and they're dominant in that main route. So everything will do well. That's why, if they're innovative, which they are. So that's the sure thing. So the growth, revenue increased 13.5 billion, and it was driven by related factors, including increasing search queries resulting from growth in user adoption and usage primarily on mobile devices, growth in advertiser spending, and improvement we have made in ad formats and delivery. So they improved their ads. That's good. Growth was adversely affected by the unfavorable effect of foreign exchange rates. YouTube ad revenues increased to 398 million from 21 to 22. The growth was driven by our brand advertising products revenue, followed by the direct response products, both of which benefited from increased spending of our advertiser as well as improvement to ad formats and delivery. Same thing. Growth was adversely affected by the unfavorable, same thing, exchange rates. Google Network went from 1.9 billion of increase. The growth was primarily driven by strength in ad sets and ad mobs from the search. That's what it is. People, all these stuff increase from the YouTube, in which Google has as well with the search. So from the system too, YouTube and search ad itself. The growth was primarily driven by strength in AdSense and AdMob. Growth was adversely affected by the unfavorable effect of foreign currency. Same thing. Monetization metrics. The following table represents change in paid and clicks and cost per click. So paid per click 10% increase, and cost per click change -1%. Paid clicks increase from increase of search queries resulting from growth in user adaptation, primarily on mobile devices. Yeah, just more users, basically, that they made more improvements with ads and deliveries. The decrease from here in cost per click was changes in device mix, geographic mix, advertising spending, ongoing product changes, and property mix, as well as the unfavorable currency exchange. Also, I just want to let you know that, because you might be thinking, because I want you to get the right idea of why I'm looking at this. So main reason why I review Google services and look specifically what increased that year is because, so let me get this straight. My main go through when I look at this is seeing if there's just anything out of the blue. It's what I just said. I'm just being analytic. None of this stuff is going to change whether I see Google is going to last for the next, let's say, 30 years or not going to. This is just seeing if there's anything out of the blue that just, because you never know. That's the whole point of this. You're just seeing this because you never know. You never know whether something like Google search that they just randomly decided to remove such an important factor in Google search, and maybe they said it here and they didn't say it in Google Focus. And when you see it here, that then changes your decision whether you want to invest in Google. That's just something. That's the kind of concept I have when I look at these areas. Is not to see, because I don't care if Google increased by 13 billion from 2021 to 2022, because I know that's going to happen. It's not a surprising thing to me. Neither is it surprising if it decreased. Why? Because a business never consistently makes more year per year, because sometimes it affects by macroeconomics, it affects by industry matters. That stuff is inevitable, but it doesn't affect. Does an industry matter whether of, let's say, a supply chain? Because that's what happened to 2021, if I remember, or no, I think that was 2022. That some businesses lowered their cash flow, lowered their net income, not because of their business, but because of something that the industry was facing based upon supply chains. So that's actually what happened to Nvidia and AMD in 2022 in terms of hardware. That there was a supply chain issue, but that's what I mean. Does that affect still, though, that Google or Nvidia per se, or Google, is going to make more money in the next 10 years? Absolutely not. It's just something that happens to the industry. But that's what I keep saying. It's just, I'm looking at this to see if there's anything out of the blue. And I'm looking at this too to see, how the business responds towards events. Because that is good to know, because it leaves you a sense of already knowing that the business could potentially do this type of decision in the future in a other situation, right? These are just more for informative reasons when you look at this stuff, but it's not something that's primarily going to decide whether you want to invest in Google, right? What's going to decide whether you invest in Google is when we read what was inside their Google services. What was inside Google services, the main revenue segment was Google search, right? And when you look at Google search, they will explain to you what Google search is. And if you understand from their explanation what Google search is, and when you look at the web of Google search and you compare it to the competitors, which I'm going to talk about in the next lesson, that's what's going to decide whether you're going to invest in Google for the long term, right? Whether you're going to invest in none or less. You're only going to invest in a company if you're going to invest in it in the long term, in the case what we're going to teach in selection. Does because I don't invest in the companies for the short term. I invest in them all the time in the long term. I don't invest in any other company for the short term. The only investments I make in the long term, which I find the most practical and most profitable, is for the long term, for the very long term. So that's why these matters, like the what was it? Looking at the revenue specifically and why it decreased. I don't care about that. I only care about that if what I just said, if it affects primarily the business, right? That's what I keep saying. What you're looking at the documents here is more for analytical reasons. If there's something more that you need to add upon to understand more about the business, about what they're selling. But it's not what's going to tell you whether you want to invest into it. What's going to tell you what you want to invest into it is going to be understanding that product, not because it made more money compared to last year to this year. That has nothing to do with it. It has to do with that product value, right? Why would I invest in Google just because their Google search increased by 30 billion from last year to this year? Because that's not going to affect at all whether they're going to make money in the next 10 years. A lot of unprofitable companies do that. A lot of unprofitable companies increase by 100% in their net income because of some favorable macroeconomic event, but it wasn't because of their product or service. You see what I mean here? Some people invest by that. I don't, because it's such an unpredictable game. I only invest if I understand fully about the product or service. So that's what I wanted to say, because the rest of this stuff, looking at their cash and equivalents, I do recommend you to look at all this, because there's something intuitive when it comes to investing. I think it's necessary for every beginner, and whether you're a beginner or not, I just believe that even if you're a veteran, to always still read the full document of these filings, because you're just going to understand more of the company, and you're going to really understand most of all about investing, how these companies work, how they invest, and how it actually helps you more in terms of insight when you want to make your own business, because you're literally reading other businesses, so it's going to help you a lot in the case if you're an entrepreneur too. So yeah, it's a total win when you read these documents. Okay, but I just wanted to be clear on that. I also read, which I'm going to talk about in the next lesson, about geographical regions. But in this lesson, I just wanted to explain analyzing more the figures in the statements. In the next lesson, I'm going to talk primarily about that long term of that product value of their competition of their customer, even though I explained that towards this lesson in what there's, or no, in the last lesson, my bad. This is just, again, impression. The increase in cost per impression was driven by a number of interrelated factors on ongoing product policy changes, ad formats. Same reason when it was here. Google's other revenues, YouTube non-advertising hardware revenues partially offset by decrease in Google Play revenues. The growth in YouTube non-advertising was largely due to the increase in paid subscribers, more people using YouTube services, paid subscription services, the growth in hardware, and also just increase in usability in YouTube in general. The growth in hardware was primarily driven by increased sales of Pixel devices. The decrease in Google Play revenue was primarily driven by the fee structure changes in 2021, as well as decrease in buyer spending. Additionally, the overall increase in Google other revenues was adversely affected by the unfavorable effect of foreign currency exchange. Google Cloud increased 7 billion from 21 to 22. The growth was primarily driven by Google Cloud Platform, followed by Google's Workspace offerings. Google Cloud's infrastructure and platform services were the largest drivers of growth in Google Cloud Platform. Okay. So the infrastructure was the biggest growth in Google Cloud Platform. So they improved that infrastructure. Many people used it on their platforms. Interesting. Okay. These are the geographic places. What does EMA stand for? I think that's Europe. EMA. I know for sure that's not China. China doesn't use as much Google. They use their own thing. Yeah, especially in regulation, what people want to look at. I know a big history of China, and they definitely want to control information. So, well, that's JD.com. People use JD.com over there. They do not use Google. That's good. I like it like that. Europe and Middle East. Okay. So, in other words, I didn't mean to go here. I meant to go to the calculator. In other words, people are using more Google in the US. People are using 46%. Now, in an increased look from the US. This decreased slightly. Also, this decreased. I'm not sure why. Well, they'll probably explain it, but okay. So look, yeah, they do explain it. EMA was unfavorably affected by the change in foreign currencies, primarily due to the US dollar strengthening relative to the euro and British pound. Yeah, but that's something macroeconomic. Currencies exchange all the time. Currencies come down and up, but net in total, this does not affect how Google will make more money in the future. Not at all. APAC wasn't favorably changing, but it was just currency. It had nothing to do with the business. People's preference on what they wanted in that country. Other Americas was grown unfavorable, affected by the changes in currency, primarily due to the U.S. strengthening relative to Argentinian pesos. Cost of revenue goes up as normal. Increase was due to other costs and revenues. Increase due to tax paid to distribution partners and to global network partners, primarily driven by growth in revenue subject to tax. Yeah, as they make more revenue, so does their cost go up to sustain that revenue. Network revenues were both substantially consistent to 21 and 22. The increase in other cost revenues from 21 to 22 is primarily driven to increase in data center costs and other operational costs, hardware costs. R&D increase in headcounts and third-party services. Increase in sales and marketing expenses, which is SG&A expenses, part of SG&A. Right? This makes in total SG&A. This is S and this is GA. So this was increase in sales and marketing due to more people. Yeah, obviously more people because they hired more people because they had more money to acquire more talent. But now they laid off a bunch of people. But look at that. Even though they laid off a bunch of people, although they haven't done it yet. Yeah, they haven't done it yet. But we have to be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised if it may increase probably for other reasons, but we shouldn't be surprised if their expenses here go down because of less people in their company because they laid off a bunch of 2023. But it has nothing to do with their business. They just had leverage and more cash to use for more talents, but they didn't expect, let's say, the inflation to come that soon. It was a tactical standpoint for each company to acquire the most talent. So then some talent, if they wanted to stay, and if not, they could leave. But in total, they got more talent from doing that. They took advantage of the cash and acquired big talent. G&A increased by headcounts and increase in third-party services. In addition, there was a $551 million increase to allowance for credit loss and account receivables. Okay, that's very small. Google services, operating income. Okay, operating income. So they're basically profitable. They were profitable before taxes and interest on Google services, and they were unprofitable. They were unprofitable in Google Cloud. Maybe this is the same thing with Microsoft. Probably. But the interesting thing is that Amazon is profitable here. So many people are using Amazon Web Services. But I don't care because that's not going to affect at all how people are going to search. No, it's not. Maybe in 90 years, but that's not the thing. That's what's happening now. That's why many people think of many possibilities, but they're not irrelevant to what's going on. So, costs primarily corporate inactivities, corporate shared costs such as finance and legal, including certain fines, settlements as costs associated with certain shared R&D activities. Hedging gains or losses related to revenues included corporate costs in total $149 billion, $2 billion in 21 and 22. Operated decreased to $5.3 billion. Oh yeah, it did decrease. It was due because of the compensation. You see more employees. They paid more employees, but that's good because they got more talent, which means they're going to make better products. And plus they laid off a bunch of people. So these expenses are going to lower, in which the stock's going to go up. Why? Because their earnings are going to improve. Remember that people buy. It's so stupid. I don't do this. Many people buy immediately just because their earnings were good. Like, oh, okay, their earnings were good. And they don't take advantage when the earnings are temporarily losing, which brings the stock down, in which you can buy at a cheaper price because the market is offering you at a cheaper price because people are bringing the market price down just because of an earnings being negative, which relatively has to do both upon with an investment or an equity, which I find hilarious, right? It's like the opposite. That's why you don't want to invest when everyone is investing into something because it's likely not the best place to invest in. That's like a universal rule for any investment. That's especially the rule with real estate. Like in real estate, where everyone is going in real estate, it's not the best place to buy because that's when prices are higher. It's the same thing with the stock market. When the earnings are going positive and are finally going to be more positive because of what I just said with the R&D and investing back into their employees, those projects are going to come into fruition, which are going to positively increase their revenue by the demand that they have in these new products or existing products. So instead of investing when it's already going up, when it's already happened, invest it before it happens when you get it at a cheaper price and it's going to rise. But people don't do that because people are emotional and stick to their factor that they think it's a good investment because other people think it's a good investment when that's not the case. An investment is good once you understand the valuation of the business based upon your research, based upon the fact. It's not taking a poll. It's looking at the facts, not by agreeing or disagreeing with other people, neither if other people agree with you or disagree with you. That's so stupid. The PE, like doing the PE, all this stuff, that's so stupid because that doesn't affect what the business really is going to make in 30 years. That's just a little point inversion that they acquired more talent because they have leverage, and where they lowered the amount of people because they knew that they couldn't last for long, because they knew inflation was going to go up and then the expenses would have to rise and they have to lay off more people, but they still had the talent that they couldn't acquire before by giving them more payments. And they still have a little bit of the leverage left. So that was it was a tactical chess strategy. And this is going to make their products and services better, and more people are going to buy the stock because their earnings are better, but that's just because their expenses went down temporarily from the layoffs. Yeah, I don't look at that, but many people do. A loss decreased 131 million on Google Cloud due to primarily driven in revenues, partially offset by compensation expenses. Oh, because their expenses are more in compensation. And they had a loss in other bets, primarily due to the compensation expenses. And these are just taxes. I don't look at that. There's nothing like a red flag or anything. This is just normal cash equivalents. So they have it mostly in government bonds. That has to be from the market, because the bonds went down. Yeah, remember we read. Remember what we read. Their marketable securities had loss of the maturity just because they matured. That's exactly what happened to Nvidia. Almost every company had a decrease in cash that had a lot of these investments into bonds and certain types of debts, because that's how they hold cash. They don't depreciate as much compared to dollars. Look at the free cash flow. It went down. Why? Okay, it wasn't because of their capex. First of all, look at here, 91.5 billion. So this wasn't a change. It was because of this. Look, their capex was 24 billion. That increased to 31 billion. Their capital expenditures went up. And this is their net operating cash flow. Look, 91 billion. See, this stands for the net operating cash flow. And that didn't make much of a difference. Let's see, from continuous operations, let's see, operating inflow. Did that increase? No, it decreased. But it was because of changing in working capital. It's just what they're doing in the business. It has nothing to do with what operating outflow, stock compensation. It's because of their capital expenditures. Okay, let's look at their capital expenditures. You see, we can look at very specific things. We can see capital expenditures are going to be right in the investing. Here it is, investing activities. Okay, so it's this. Yeah, it was because of that. Look, if you look at this, it was because of the macroeconomics of their marketable securities and because of acquisitions. Remember, they bought that company. Remember, we just said they bought that company called Meltoid, something like that, and that cost about 6 billion. Yeah, you see, it increased. Okay, thank you. Yeah, it increased to 6 billion. So look, it was because their acquisition macroeconomic securities on their bonds, here it is, the macroeconomic securities of their bonds that went down, and their purchases went down in the securities, obviously, because it's bonds and the yield, and purchases of property equipment. But I would say is most of all with the marketable securities going down temporarily, and the acquisition. So combine that, you have about $4 billion difference with a $31 billion difference. But of course they're earning, okay, because they sold. See, they sold less. See, look, their purchase equipments went up. Their purchases of securities went down, which means their expenses went down. You have to look at the statements, guys. The sales of marketable securities went down because the prices went down a lot in the macroeconomics, especially with the markets of 2022. Purchases of non-marketable securities went down because of that. This went down, but this is affected as much. Acquisitions, net sales, which was Montoid, increased 5 billion of expenses. So their cash went down because they used the cash to pay the acquisitions, and their cash went down because they lost a bit of value from the securities. So the whole reason here is because of macroeconomics and because they acquired a new company, which decreased their free cash flow a bit. But their operating cash flow actually improved, right? That affected their cash because they used the cash to buy another company. Watch. Look, it decreased. Actually, no. You see, marketable securities. That was the short-term investment. This is what stands for short-term investments. Look, it's that simple. If it wasn't for the short-term investments, if their short-term investments had the same, if they still had the same, if they didn't sell any of their securities because of what was going on macroeconomically, they would have in cash about 21, so still the same amount of what they have now, 21,879 plus this 118. This would actually improve because they have more cash than before, because they saved more from their revenue. The revenue that came in, they decided to save more of what they had than last year. See, 140 billion. In fact, the cash would have increased. It would have increased up to here. But why did it go down? Because of the macroeconomics from the bonds going down. Their valuation went down from the marketable securities. It went down by 118 minus 91 is about 27 billion. So that was it. It was just because of the marketable securities. So it's macroeconomic, it has nothing to do with the business. Okay, so that's a reason for us to be very interested into Google.